Birds kinda suck. Women, I wish, sucked a little more than they do now. Put them together and what do you get? Well, that depends on who you ask. To some, you've just described a horrifying monster from the mines of ancient Greece who tore apart the bodies of their victims before chewing their remains to bits with their razor-sharp teeth. To others, you may have just described their sexual fetish. To me, you have just described my sexual fetish. And I'm not judging you, I'm simply stating that my preference of bird women is far superior to yours. The Valkyries, sometimes correctly spelled with a W rather than a V, were known by the Norse as the Valkyrja, or Choosers of the Slain, which is a name just begging to be attached to an obscure 80s metal song which slaps harder than my dad after drink number 3. This name, like all other names throughout mythology, is meant to be taken literally once you translate it out. The Valkyrja are said to be female servants of Odin, riding out into the mortal world to observe and sometimes get involved with humanity. In more than one way. Girl, I don't know why. If only I should be so lucky. Something interesting to note about these girls is that it is actually a generally accepted theory that their legend stems back to the early Germanic peoples in the heart of modern-day Deutschland, like when the Celts and the Germanic people were still in contact with one another. The evidence for this is exactly what I proposed in my Tuwa de Dannen video about the possible origins of Morian. By the way, I didn't actually know this was a legitimate theory at the time. My single brain cell actually picked up on the pattern recognition all by itself. Feel free to stroke my ego in the comments section below. Trust me, all that praise will eventually turn into an internal dick-measuring contest in my psyche which will cause me to spiral further and further into an inescapable depression where alcohol is my only alleviation. Even then, thoughts of my father's words echo through my mind of how I'll never amount to anything, and the cycle just repeats itself over and over again, with the ultimate promise of solace being my untimely death, wherein the voices which relentlessly torment my mind will finally be silenced. I was talking about bird women, wasn't I? Well, since I already know some of you are riding my ass about calling the Valkyries bird women, when in fact this is a later revision to their design influenced by the romanticization of mythical figures brought upon by the sudden uptick in popularity of a certain other religion which definitely needed to be consulted when this shit eventually got written down. However, there is a basis for this design in Germanic mythology, where their Valkyries have the ability to transform into swans. One of them is actually named Yilad Gudr Svanvit, which translates to White Swan. And harkening back to Morian, it is said that she chose who among the Celts would die in battle by disguising herself as a raven. So there is a basis for this popularized appearance in Norse mythology, however there still isn't any sort of skaldic poem which mentions these women having a pair of literal wings sprouting out of their back. Frankly though, the bird women evolution makes more sense than the artistic depictions of these gals riding out onto battle on the backs of Pegasi? Flying horses. You're expected to believe that somehow they were able to find a whole string of mythical flying creatures, of which there were only ever one which was born out of highly unusual circumstances where the blood of a Gorgon rape victim was splattered out in the middle of nowhere in fucking ancient Greece? It makes sense if you don't think about it. If you're hoping for a more detailed and accurate depiction of the Valkyries in the Eddas, I'm sorry to say that all Snorri elaborates on is that they definitely do fly and ride horses, though as I have alluded to already, the presence of wings on either of them is curiously absent. Perhaps the oldest and most vague depiction we have of the Valkyries is found on the Janvide stone, which clearly shows a figure, probably Odin, riding on a big-ass horse with 8 legs, clearly Sleipnir, but then has some strange figure floating above his head horizontally, and another greeting him outside with a drinking horn. The popular working theory is that these are in fact an early pre-Christian depiction of Valkyries, though it's kind of hard to tell since A, these are literal fucking stick figures, and B, the few bits of the stone we can read denote this as a memorial gift from an unnamed individual to his brother, either by blood or by arms, Hjolulfr, who presumably fell in battle and was dragged off to Valhalla, where the Valkyries serve him mead and tend to his every need. Unintentional rhyme was unintentional. Oh, and he was probably a sailor too. Don't want to forget about that bottom field. There are a few more theories concerning this stone, like supposedly that's not really Odin, but Hjolulfr riding Sleipnir, or the floating figure is Hjolulfr being personally escorted to Valhalla by Odin himself, which poses the question of whether this was the exception or the rule, or the plain possibility that Valkyries aren't in this image at all, and the similarities I pointed out are purely circumstantial. Whatever the case may be, we also know that the depictions of Valkyries as dainty, slim-waisted, girl power-exuding heroines is also the byproduct of pop culture, as Valkyries of old are implied to be burly, muscular women who love to engage in mortal combat and smash the skulls of their enemies. In the Icelandic poem Dara Alioth, composed sometime after the Battle of Kluntov in 1014, the Valkyries show their true colors and hold true to their title of Choosers of the Slain, by perching themselves next to the battlefield, picking out which warriors would fall in battle as they weaved a tapestry out of entrails and human heads. You might think that this is a boner killer for me, however, joke's on you, I'm into it. The point I'm getting at here is that the archetypal Valkyrie, much like all mythological figures, is a bit disingenuously represented in pop culture and leads to quite a few people asking some rather suggestive questions as to how the Valkyries are traditionally depicted, leading some to wonder whether or not the Valkyries ever truly were females. Well, there are two answers to that quandary. The correct response, which is that by examining both the gendered nouns which prominently make up their names, as well as the multitude of poems which attest to them falling in love with mortal men in a society which, as far as I can tell, has no marital concept of homosexuality, points to them all being 100% female. Then you have the contrived post-modernist response given by those who can't get people to read their shitty journal any other way than by being controversial and making totally idiotic statements. This is Kathleen M. Self, a religious historian from St. Lawrence University who, quote-unquote, specializes in medieval Iceland and, oh, fucking hell, neo-paganism. Now, despite being a self-proclaimed feminist who is currently trying to conflate weight with the personal identity of the female gender, the main basis for her thesis on the Nordic Valkyries being part of a never-before-mentioned third gender in Germanic society is totally reliant upon our current definitions of gender roles. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why I despise the current state of academia, because we can get nut jobs who unironically write shit like this and are taken seriously. Valkyries and shield maidens, like the strong women of the sagas, are met with admiration, though not as paragons of femininity. As this article argues, these figures are best understood as a third gender, a hybrid of masculine and feminine characteristics that were dominant during the time period explored. Hey dumbass, they're called tomboys and they're hot as fuck. I think the most insufferable part of this journal is when she claims that once Valkyries get married to a man, they suddenly magically stop being this third gender and immediately revert back to being females again because they take on more characteristics of a homemaker. If I unironically said that a woman wasn't really a female until she got her ass in the kitchen and made me a sandwich, I'd be crucified by the sensitivity mob. But because Dr. Kathleen being fat as a personality self said it, and it's current year, this is giving people legitimate pause. Fucking keck. Seeing as we are teetering dangerously close to a full-blown political discourse, let's just move on to the various Valkyries and what their names mean. Now, while some people think that there are only 11 different Valkyries in Norse mythology, since those are the only ones Odin bothers to list off in the Grimnismal, there's really something more like 39 named Valkyries and almost certainly more unnamed ones. A lot of them have the Norse word for spear, which is gyr, as the root word for their name, and some verb you can do with a spear making up the latter half of their title. For example, you have Gyrskogul, meaning spear shaker, Gyravor, spear goddess, Gyronul, charging with a spear, and Gyrdrithel, spear flinger, which reminds me of a racial slur my grandfather used, which I am pretty sure he made up on the spot because I have never heard anyone else use it since then. Most of these Valkyries are sadly unremarkable, as the majority of them are merely mentioned once in passing throughout the various skaldic poems and never brought up again. The exceptions are worthy of actually being brought up in this video, with the exception of Brunhild, who definitely deserves a future mythological character study. That should tell you just how significant she is. Let's start with Savafa, mentioned in the... Excuse me for a moment, I need to channel my inner Kraut for this one. Mentioned in the Helga Vita Hrodvardssonar as a strikingly beautiful Valkyrie, whom the hero Helgi falls for and pretty much just simps over until he gets his way in the end. Something worth mentioning about Savafa, and this could apply to the other Valkyries as well, is that she's not some immortal godlike being who lives in the halls of Valhalla, but instead is a very mortal being who lives with her father, King Ilimi, even after she and Helgi end up married. Which apparently makes her a female now, except for the fact that the passage clearly reads, "She was a Valkyrie just as before," you know, in case you thought I didn't bury this stupid-ass narrative enough before. Next up is Skuld, who pulls double duty in Asgard as both a Valkyrie and one of the three Norns. And this isn't just some sort of overlapping oversight on the part of Snorri, as the Gylfaginning poignantly states, "These are the Valkyrs. Them Odin sends to every battle. They determine men's fairness and award victory. Gudr and Rota and the youngest Norn, she who is called Skuld, ride ever to take the slain and decide fights." Now, it's never clearly stated, however, we can assume that through her position as both a Norn, who governs fate itself, and a Valkyrie, that Skuld should hold more influence in deciding who gets to live and who gets shish kebabbed. If that is the case, if Skuld wants you dead, you are double screwed. Well, technically triple screwed, since the whole reason Odin gathers the Reinhardt in Valhalla is so he can chuck them at an oversized dog during the end of the world, but I digress. Eir is a bit of a weird one. So her name means mercy, and she is said to specialize in medicine, which is a little antithetical to what a Valkyrie is supposed to do as a chooser of the slain. This apparent contradiction has led some to speculate that she was initially a healing goddess, or, harkening back to what I said earlier about Svafafa, she could serve as merely a medic for the Valkyries themselves in case a stray arrow comes out and strikes one of them. And finally we have Prudir, or as she is also known, Thrud, whose name literally translates to strength. Why am I rolling my R's? What is interesting about Thrud is that she shares her name with the daughter of Thor, and while it is not explicitly clear whether or not they are the same person, it's not hard to imagine the daughter of the strongest god of the Aesir taking up a position under her grandfather's tutelage. At the end of the day, the Valkyries are just as good a candidate as any from Norse mythology as to the problems associated with pop culture fucking with ancient religions. The Norse figures as of late have been heavily romanticized to fit in with everyone's intimate bias towards the cinematic universe of the dashingly handsome yet clean-pressed Chris Hemsworth, rather than the much more accurate depiction of Valkyries as tall, burly women who look like they could crush my head between their thighs, and I gladly let them. Thank you all so much for watching today's video, but before we close out for today, I'd like to do something a little different. Some of you may recall back about a month or so now, I did a video on Finnish mythology according to the Kalevala, which inexplicably did really well, like holy shit. Well, apparently, the Finns like their mythology quite a bit. Either that, or I put in a really specific phrase in the description to manipulate the algorithm, because Susan and the other demonic powers at B recommended 2 channels to me, both run by Finnish content creators, and both of which also create content dealing with mythology. So instead of shilling out my own nonsense to cap off today's video, I'd like to acknowledge Hermias Malak and Antti Palosari. If you guys are looking for other channels which make mythological content which isn't total crap, I'd highly recommend checking them both out, if for nothing else to find out what a Finnish accent sounds like. Don't play pretend, you had no idea what it sounded like either. Huge thanks once again to all of my Patreon supporters, Kitch Fairman, Pyrotic Napalm, and Pen Stift. If any of you guys are interested in my Patreon page, as well as all the different perks associated with it, follow that link down below. Any and all contributions would be greatly appreciated. Don't forget about our Messiahs and Mythology Discord, where we occasionally get together for discussions of mythology, share ideas for future videos, and make fun of Glitch Dolphin. It's mostly making fun of Glitch Dolphin. Don't feel bad, he deserves it. And with that, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, my name is Messiah, and I hope you all have a God's blessed day.